Thank you, Kimberly, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to tell you something you already know. This morning, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences announced that Bengt Holmström, MIT's Paul A. Samuelson Professor of Economics, with a joint appointment at MIT Sloan, has been awarded a 2016 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. He and his colleague, Professor Oliver Hart of Harvard, share the award for their contributions to contract theory. Professor Hart taught at MIT from 1985 to 1993. As the Academy noted in bestowing this honor, contracts are essential to the functioning of modern societies, and their research has been invaluable in helping us understand real-life contracts and institutions, as well as the potential pitfalls when designing new contracts. Bengt Holmström joined the MIT faculty in 1994 and served as head of the Department of Economics from 2003 to 2006. He is the fifth person to win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences while serving as a member of our faculty. With this achievement, he builds on the remarkable legacy of professors Paul Samuelson, Franco Modigliani, Robert Solow, and Peter Diamond, and the intellectual community here at MIT, in which they thrived. Among Professor Holmström's many other distinctions, he's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Finance Association, and the Econometric Society, where he previously served as president. He's also a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, which granted him today's great honor. I want to close on a personal note. When someone wins a Nobel Prize, the rest of us tend to place that person on a pedestal, far above the level of normal human achievement. So I would like the world to understand and to know that MIT's latest Nobel laureate is not only an extraordinary economic thinker. Bengt Holmström is also an outstanding citizen of MIT and a delightful human being. I worked with Bengt directly when I served as MIT's provost, including during the difficult period following the global financial crisis of 2008. I found him, without exception, to be an absolute pleasure to work with. He is disarmingly honest, decent, forthcoming, collaborative, objective, open-minded. And you will not be surprised to learn that he is data-driven. And you will be as delighted as I was to discover his world-class sense of humor. Bengt also helped this electrical engineer to fully appreciate the jewel that is MIT's Department of Economics. The department is known for its combination of outstanding human beings and superb economic talent. And Bengt stands as a perfect example of both. On that note, please join me in welcoming MIT's latest Nobel laureate, Professor Bengt Holmström.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. And very kind of you to come here on a holiday, and sorry that I disturbed it. And thank you, Raphael, for those kind words. I don't really have any notes. This is my shopping list, but I thought it's appropriate to some paper here in front of me so that I feel a little more comfortable. Let me tell you first that I'm still dazed. I think Sean can tell, has had the same experience. It's not that one doesn't think about these possibilities, because people, especially in Cambridge, talk so much about them, but one doesn't really expect it in some ways. So at least that's true for me. So I'm still wondering whether I will wake up or not, or whether this is the real thing. But you look great and real, so it must be. I must live. Who said that? I'm thinking. I'm of course very happy, very grateful, and as I said, overwhelmed, but above all perhaps lucky, because I want to start by saying that there's just a great deal of luck already, because there are a lot of deserving people, but also for being at the right place at the right time in some ways. I actually started my research outside academia and got interested in incentives and just happened to arrive at Stanford at a time when that was actually also a topic of interest. I should, by the way, say I just realized that I should say that I'm grateful to a list of people also, before I tell a little bit more about this. One of which, most important, is my wife, who is somewhere here, and it's we as academics who are married know that it's a big sacrifice for the family, and she has been very much part of this whole enterprise. And of my son, who isn't here yet, who also has been very much with me. And then, of course, my colleagues here at MIT, you guys, and especially I should mention, of course, Sean, who has been my co-author for a long time and carried me along and helped me understand things. And Oliver Hart, I couldn't be more delighted at sharing the prize with him, because we have been friends for a long time and worked together. And they are not here, but especially I would say Bob Wilson, who was my advisor at Stanford. He is an extraordinary person, and at some level, he doesn't have yet a Nobel Prize, but let me tell you, I think all of us who know him think of him as standing above the Nobel Prize. So I think those are the most important people. So let me get back to the story that about the luck. It is of course, there must be something to get this prize, but the one thing that's really, I think, critical is the combination of being in the right place at the right time, and Stanford was such a place. After Stanford, I went back. I came to America as a cultural exchange student, and I was supposed to go back to the workplace where I had been working on incentives. But because economics was interested in the topic, I stayed at Stanford and did my PhD there. Then I went back for 2 years to Europe because you had to leave. I was on a visa where I had to leave for 2 years. I now realize that a lot of people buy themselves out or something like that. But being from Finland, I should say, we do things the way we have written them in the contract, and we don't renegotiate. Those people are at Harvard. No, just Oliver is special expert on renegotiation. So I was boring and went back, but finally, actually through Rudy Dornbusch and Stan Fisher, who are not here, Rudy unfortunately died. They were instrumental in sort of getting me to come here back to the US in general and eventually also to MIT. So Northwestern is the other place I want to mention as a lucky draw in some sense, because Northwestern is the place, I think, which had at the time, I'm talking now, the late 70s, early 80s, had an extraordinary group of people working, and that included Paul Milgram, who is somebody I have co-authored with, and I'm certain will get the Nobel Prize soon, and Roger Myerson, who got the Nobel Prize, Nancy Stokey, and John Roberts. I mean, these are all very central figures in this field. So for those who are students here or something, getting together, getting into a team, intellectual team that works on a topic and is excited about it is really important. I should say, by the way, that when I look at my own department now, MIT's economics department right now, there is exactly that spirit going on. I think there is something really exciting cooking in economics at MIT. And we were just talking about that fact with President Reif, that even though it's not at all my field, namely it's empirical work mainly, I have that same feeling that we had, at Northwestern when I look at people, how they interact in seminars and so on. So that's really exciting, and it's going to produce a lot of Nobel Prize winners in the future. I don't want to say very much about, just say that my trajectory, intellectual trajectory has it took off at Stanford, but really took off at Northwestern after that. And then I went to Yale with Paul Milgram, where I did a lot of, I personally think my best work together with Paul. And that was another lucky draw that I had a chance to. They were not. Oliver Williamson was also there, but those were very special days. And that's, by the way, when Oliver and Sandy Grossman wrote their famous paper on which Oliver got the prize on incomplete contracting. And that was also an era where people came, and incentive theory was really, information economics was really exciting. And eventually, I moved here in '94, as you heard, and this has been maybe academically a transition time for me, and a slower time in many ways. Not easy all the time, but in some ways I'm very glad to get this prize, because this way I have at least returned something to MIT and to MIT economics. But in the last, say, 6 years in the financial crisis has been intellectually very rewarding, maybe not so productive, but it started with the work together with Jean, which was the Finnish financial crisis, and then eventually we exported the financial crisis to the rest of the world. And there come a second dose that I worked with Gary Gorton. I'm still working with Gary Gorton in particular. And that has been a very exciting time for me, in the sense that I'm back into the mode of really thinking about problems which you can lie in bed, or wake up at night and be excited about. And even though maybe I haven't been as productive as in the early years, I would say that this is as good a problem, or as good ideas that I have had as during my earlier career. So that's a short summary. I didn't. You can hear my shopping list also, but I don't think you want to hear about it. But I don't know if you want to ask questions or not. I didn't get any further instructions about telling about my work. I don't think you want to hear about my work. Those who understand what I say know it already, and those who don't understand will not be wiser if I tell it. So with these words, again, thank you very much for coming, and thank you the many of you who have been a very big part of my life.
Even more on a phone bridge, so we'll sort of alternate between the room and the phone Reuters?
Hi, Professor Holmström. Use the microphone. Hi, Professor Holmström. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Can you talk about what you make of the current state of executive pay in connection with the research that you've done and your work on incentives? Is there currently roughly the right incentives for executive pay? Is it too high, too low? What do you make of it in general?
Thank you. That's obviously a very hot topic, and let me start by saying we don't think much about the level. That is, economics doesn't have an opinion really on the level. If I were an empiricist or I had studied, competition in the labor market, which I somewhat have studied, I understand why the level has risen. But I don't have a stand on whether it's too high or too low. It is what it is. And I just want to say that I don't think it is some huge scheming, or I'm not of that opinion, but it is somehow demand and supply working its magic. That said, I'm not particularly happy that it causes so much heart trouble, and it could, in principle, by the way, have a negative effect or have had a negative effect also on companies and such. So that would be a concern that we are interested in, or I'm interested in, is the efficiency dimension. But one thing I can say is that it wasn't in good shape. There was the Enron scandal. Some of you are so young you don't remember it, but there was a big scandal about Enron. First 3 years, the world's most brilliant company, voted by Fortune, I think, or Business Week. And then for the fourth year, it was bankrupt, and it was the biggest scandal, corporate scandal in my lifetime. So, and it was blamed on executive compensation and inside scheming and all sorts of things. But I think the main problem with that scheme was that it was not, they were not vested. That is, the executives could cash out very quickly. And so they got new. And I think we theorists at the time, I'm sure Jean was part of it, and we spoke up about it and said that is really the problem. The problem wasn't options, which most people thought. I think that's just a total misdiagnosis of the problem. The problem was that people could sell out. And incidentally, stock or shares is a option. So going from saying options are awful to giving shares is just changing the parameter of a family of the same family of instruments. But I'm emphasizing it's vested because I think they went in a direction which is even a sorrier state right now. But I think it has gone because of all the talk about it. They have just not diagnosed the problem correctly. Maybe now they are talking about vesting more, and they have become, and that's. But the mess. I was on the Nokia board for 13 years, and I think the executive compensation went from reasonable to absolutely dreadful. And dreadful because of all the consultants that had to be there to speak up about this. And today's compensation looks anything like it looked at 2012 when I left the Nokia board, I tell you, I think nobody has an idea what these schemes. There's so many pieces of it, and it's just a mess. How's that for an answer? I wish they would listen a little bit more about what we know or understand about executive compensation.
Hi. I wanted to turn the question around and aim it at the people further down in the totem pole about what your research would have to say about the desperate unhappiness of millions of Americans about how they're compensated for their work, the feeling that nobody's getting anywhere, that the middle class is stagnated. Does your research have any implications for that?
It's not my field of expertise, but I do say this, I'm quite very concerned, like I think many in this room, perhaps most in the room. That is what we are seeing right now in terms of the way, say, the market economics is playing itself out. I would say that it is of great concern. And I would much rather live in in a society where this wasn't happening. But that's the way it is, and I'm not sure. I'm not prepared to speak about the question of how to repair it, because you are tinkering with a very complicated situation. The market. I wouldn't want to start to redistribute, at least in a thoughtless way. I think there's a lot one can do on taxation and so on, but the consequences can sometimes be very unexpected. But it is a worrisome development as far as I'm concerned.
And we'll take a question from the audio bridge now.
Thank you. Our first question over the phone comes from Abad Lee of Associated Press.
Hi, Dr. Holmström. Would you please answer this question in Finnish, please, for our Finnish TV members? If you could please tell us what it's like, what it means to you to be only the 5th person from Finland to have won a Nobel Prize. Thank you.
Se tietysti tarkoittaa erittäin paljon, että on saanut tämän palkinton suomalaisena. On edelleen suomalainen, vain Suomen kansalainen. Mä koen sen sellaisena, että mä erittäin pitkälle sen myös suomalaisena ansainnut. Ja se on tietysti itselleni ilahduttavaa, että mä oon voinut tällaisen palkinnon saada Suomen puolesta. Ja mä oon kiitollinen Suomesta siitä.
I'm Tarun from Tencent. In China, many state-owned companies' top executives are treated as government officials, not professional managers. They have less motivation to compete in free market, and sometimes they got committed to corruption. And China is undergoing SOE reforms. What's your suggestions for the reforms in relation of your theory?
May I just understand, were you talking about executives in China or bureaucrats? I didn't quite understand.
Yes, many big companies in
state-owned
companies.
Okay. Just a few things. One thing to understand is that bureaucracies and government enterprises are among the most difficult to organize. I think this is an example where people sort of feel, why don't they just behave like competitive firms, or, what is this red tape? We have actually Abhijit Banerjee here who has written about red tape. But it's important to understand it's part of the bureaucracy is part of the solution in the first instance, not the problem. But it grows, excessively, and in a place perhaps like China that doesn't have a competitive market that puts pressure, the bureaucracy sort of grows too big and becomes corruption and so on and so forth. But it's important to understand that having a government or being even a university, fortunately here is competition in the US, so the President Reif, is running this enterprise in a competitive market, so to speak. You see the education system in Europe, and I'm looking at Sean or something, I have heard him talk about it over the years. It's a lot harder to run a company in a non-competitive environment. It may seem like it's unpleasant, but actually in the long run it's a lot harder. So that's perhaps an unusual answer, but I'm not prepared to say, I don't know China well enough. I can't speak about it, but I think they are facing a big challenge, and to the extent they can bring in some market competition or something like that in suitable amounts in suitable places, I think that obviously would help also the problem you are mentioning.
We'll take a question from Bloomberg on the phone bridge.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Craig Torres of Bloomberg News.
Hi, Professor. The government does a lot of high-risk research, and companies often leverage off that research. You can think of a whole slew of developments from GPS to the internet to many other things where the private side has benefited from government research. What's the best way for industry and government to contract, and perhaps a way that gives the public sector a little bit more of those profits?
Well, thank you. It's a complicated equation. There's private enterprise, there are universities, there's government. On the whole, I think the government's role is to support universities. And I'm not saying it just because I'm an academic. It is the area where what we call externalities or beneficial effects spread the most. So I'm a strong supporter for the government is absolutely instrumental for education, for research within universities, and so that support is very clear. Whether the government should somehow get directly involved with and support firms, that I'm very doubtful about. In fact, I have a rather negative attitude to it, because giving money to enterprises by the government faces a lot of challenges. It's making the playing field uneven. It's also the case that if you give a 10 million to a company, it's not clear it goes to what it nominally goes to. That is, it could be just 10 million go into dividends or something like that. There's a leakage problem. So I think the government's main role with regard to enterprises is just to try to make sure that there's a level playing field, and perhaps they procure some things which may be valuable. But the route to take is through various research institutions, in foremost, I think, universities.
So we have a question from the live webcast. Summer Wang, also with Tencent in China, asks, earlier today you said you had communicated with Professor Oliver Hart. What did you say to each other?
Congratulations.
There you go, Summer. Oh, we're good. Are there any more from the room? We can wrap up. And we'll be around for a little bit.
Thank you very much. By the way, nothing like this happened when Peter Diamond won the Nobel Prize. What was it? The world is changing, obviously. I thought this would be a family affair. But thank you all for coming and with.
Thank you so much. And so for those, I know there are some of the local television stations here. If you need a quick stand-up, look for Abby Abazorius, raise your hand, Sarah McDonnell in the back right, or Carl Liddy Jean-Baptiste, who you met on the way in. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate it.